Let's talk a little bit today about why musical practices matter. Last time we talked about musical practices and how music is not a science. So this time we're going to talk just a little bit about why understanding musical practices is important when you're learning music. So let's start with a little story about a hypothetical person named Alex. Now, Alex is really good at guitar. He learned to play classical guitar growing up, and he never ever learned to play another style of guitar. And why didn't he learn to play another style of guitar? Well, maybe his teacher used this phrase, which I've actually heard more than a few times, definitely more than the number of times that I want to have heard it. If you can do classical, you can do anything. So Alex grows up, keeps playing classical guitar, keeps taking lessons from his teacher, and starts to get paid gigs. That is, he's playing music professionally to make money. Something that's really hard to do, mind you. So he gets a gig one day with a group of jazz musicians. He decides to take the gig. So having gotten really good at classical music, Alex just thinks, if you can do classical, you can do anything. So Alex shows up to the gig an hour early for the quick run-through before the performance and says, "Where is my sheet music?" The jazz band laughs him out of the room, he's fired from the gig, and he's traumatized. I'm busy probably for the next few hours. See, Alex had never become familiar with the jazz musical practice. He was a good musician in the classical world, but not in the jazz world. I guess if you can do classical, you can't do anything. The sad part is, if Alex had been introduced to the jazz musical world early on, he might have really liked it. In fact, he might have liked it more than classical music. But because classical music had declared itself better than everything else, it was just dismissed. So we talked about last time how music takes place within musical practices. Well, the same thing's true for music learning. Music learning can take place within different musical practices. Any type of music making, or you can just shorten it to musicking, involves improvising, making music up on the spot. Performing, meaning music that you've memorized or music that you're sight reading on the spot. Conducting, waving your arms around to direct other musicians. Arranging, taking someone else's song and reworking it so it sounds different. Or composing, which is creating brand new works of music. Each one of these activities has a special place in a musical practice, but musical practices can use each one more than the other. Let's do a few examples. So just using an arbitrary 1 to 5 rating, we could say that improvising is not very important to classical music. Performing is probably the most important part of it, and conducting and composing being the next most important thing. If we were to use the same system with jazz, you could see that improvising is much more important in jazz, and then performing a previously written piece is still pretty important, but only in certain ensemble types do you have a conductor in jazz. You're oftentimes arranging a standard library of songs over composing an entirely new piece, most of the time. Let me be clear, this is all up for debate, and I'm just speaking very generally. We could use another example, pop music. You're usually performing a piece the same way most of the time. There's hardly ever a conductor. Arranging has a moderate amount of importance, covers, and people often value an original song over a cover. Again, this is just to illustrate that different musical practices value different things. So ideally, you want to be a well-rounded musician, meaning you're good in all different kinds of areas of music making and at least familiar with different musical practices. You want to be able to move between different musical worlds without making a fool of yourself. I mean, nobody's going to actually laugh at you. That would be really unprofessional, but my point still stands. Ideally, you do want to be good in all of these areas of musicking, right? The point is not to become a 5 in all of these areas. The point is to become a well-rounded musician so that you are comfortable and familiar with these different areas. The same way that you should be comfortable and well-rounded enough to recognize when other musical cultures have different values than your musical culture. So how do you become well-rounded? So you want to take a look at a lot of different musical practices and see how they do things. Now, you don't need to become an expert in every musical practice. Just like our last illustration, you could spend an entire lifetime learning learning from one of these 3 musical practice examples, and you still probably would have a lot left to learn by the time your life was over. You want to sample, but you want to specialize. Specialize in the thing that you enjoy the most. Don't specialize in something just because somebody tells you that it's better than other things. I'm looking at you, classical. Spend time studying the thing that you enjoy. Well, that's an easy answer if it's just somebody that already knows where they're coming from and what they want to do. Obviously, they're going to spend time doing that. So what if you have students who don't know what they like yet? They're taking music in order to find out which practice they like the best. And this is a very difficult question. In fact, it's almost kind of like a paradox, because with the help of role models or teachers or mentors, you learn music by immersing and inducting yourself into a music practice. So if we have to take part in a musical practice specifically while also being a well-rounded musician, I know it seems like a paradox, but we do have to choose a musical practice as a starting point, as a foundation for our learning. And oftentimes we choose classical music, and it makes perfect sense. Classical music has a great notation system for learning to read music off of a piece of paper. That comes from classical music, and for a starting musician, that's an extremely useful skill to have. Classical music provides the structure, lots of technique, a long history, and lots of traditions, things that you can follow that have value in a community. But in my world, there are also cultural reasons why classical music is good. For example, classical music just fits in with the Western lifestyle. We have schedules, we have time that we can allot to practice, we have carefully planned rehearsals, carefully laid out music notation. Western culture loves to plan things. It's pretty uncommon for people in Western society to just start randomly making music on the streets. And oftentimes we're so disconnected and independent that we don't wait around for that to happen anyway. We want to sit down, practice, perform, and then get on with our day. Another thing is it's appreciated in most places. Classical music has spread throughout the globe, and in general, it's really easy to find a classical music teacher. But just because classical music is a great starting point for learning music, that does not mean it's the only kind of music worth studying. Is this loud enough? It's fine. Once you get a foundation in a certain type of music making, you can begin to branch out and synthesize and integrate other types of music making to gain a more global perspective on how an instrument can be played. It gives you a perspective on all the different possibilities and also makes you a more well-rounded musician so that you can do different types of gigs and you can appreciate different styles of music. And this is often difficult for classical musicians to understand because the Western classical music practice has so many rules, traditions, ways of notating things, practices for specific outcomes. Oftentimes teachers give up on other traditions completely because they don't know them, because they don't know how to give students all of the right answers. But that would be missing the point. Western classical music values having the right answers, but other musical practices might not need you to have the right answers in order to provide value to your students' musical learning. See, the classroom isn't always a place to just dispense information. It's also a context simulator. And when you're making music within this context simulator, you're doing reflective music making. It's where you do a performance and you think and reflect as to how you could improve it. Instead of trying to fit that style of music into a Western model, just make it as authentic as you possibly can based on examples from recordings or from information from somebody within that culture. And as long as it's genuine and authentic and coming from a true place of openness, you will be learning something. You will be gaining perspective and gaining appreciation for another kind of music making. As a bonus, something like jazz has a well-established framework for improvising. Students could benefit from that just the same way that they benefit from reading music from the classical world. So to summarize, having a solid foundation in a musical practice is important, but it's also important to know what you love and to know what you want to pursue more, even if it's outside of your foundation. And that's something that only you can answer, which brings me to my very last point. In different musical practices, you might hear somebody saying that another person is a real musician just because they share the same values as that person. That doesn't mean anything. In fact, it's just a jab. It's a way to pass judgment. Our friend Alex here is a real musician. He might be more familiar with classical music, but he's still a real musician because he spends a lot of time working on music and he enjoys doing it. Just because he was unfamiliar with a different musical practice doesn't mean he's less of a real musician than those jazz musicians who spend lots of time and do lots of hard work to do the music that they enjoy doing. In fact, I bet you that a lot of jazz musicians have the same foundational learning that Alex has. And there are also tons of great pop musicians who've never had any classical training, but are able to make some extremely valuable contributions to the musical world. Although they're very lucky to have that talent, it's still a perfectly valid way to participate in music. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying this more music philosophy edition of Mr. Beacon. I certainly think it's important for people to know about this stuff, because as I look up things online, there's a heavy bias towards Western classical music, especially in a time where music notation is becoming less important. We can listen to recordings from literally every type of music in the world for free. As I said last time, YouTube won't let me make any money off of this channel until I get 1,000 subscribers. So if you want to subscribe, just think of it as giving me a donation, but YouTube is the one paying for it. And if you would, share it with your friends, send it to people who might have an opinion on this topic. Maybe they disagree with me, and we can talk about it in the comments. Thanks for watching.